Okay, so we're going to start in a minute.
People might have
Even me, I have to look.
Oh, really?
Like, you know,
It's better than high speed here.
ich war jetzt so lange draußen.
Okay.
Gestern war es so, ich sagen muss, dass wir ein technisches Problem haben. Das ist nicht so. Und wir sind in diesem Haus mit dem viel Holz. Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, welcome and good afternoon. My name is Michael Hauser. I'm at the University and so I'm extremely delighted to have you here. It's the first oral session, oral presentation of this afternoon, and it's on multiple crises. Now, an extremely important topic, right? We've heard the presentations to which I really look forward to, and basically what comes after the core title, all institutions, policies, quite exciting contribution. Now, Peter's not speaking. I have two tasks for the speakers. We have 10 minutes per presentation, 5 minutes discussion. This is the yellow card. If it's okay for the speakers, that's minute 8. Yeah, that means you have 2 more than self-explanatory. Yeah, I'll be sitting there on the gatekeeper's chair. So, you know, don't ignore me. Yeah, and with that, let me introduce you the first speaker. I see to Wander, talking about regulation and certification. An important topic when it comes to trade. In your case for bioinputs in the paper, we compare the set of regulations. The floor is yours, and I start counting then. If you need a microphone, no, colleagues, we need to record.
It's recorded anyway, so it's not necessary to speak louder, but if you want to have as you.
So, thank you, Mr. Chair, for the introduction. Thank you for being here in this, as the Chair said, first session of oral presentations. We want, together with the colleagues, Renato is here, the other colleague is still on the way to here. My name is Marcelo. We want to show a short study that we did comparing the regulation certification policies countries have or are trying to implement regarding bioinputs. Bioinputs mean microorganism-based inputs that are used in agriculture to promote plant growth, to control pests, to improve nutrient efficiency and so on, biological nitrogen fixation and so on. So now it's we compared the conditions or situations that started from the information found from 3 countries in different continents. We tropical regions where we looked for Brazil, India, and Nigeria. Why those 3 countries? Was let's say we just decided let's have one country from each continent where agriculture has a relevance, and that we are already trying to implement local regulations for those kind of inputs. So that's why we choose one country per continent. And we observe the legal frameworks, how certification processes go on, and how does the government support the use of those biofuels. And of course, identify challenges and opportunities in each of those countries. Then, if we look first at Brazil, Brazil is the country where we 3 authors come from. We have a long discussion already in place. We have a national program in place to promote the use of bio-inputs. There is a global movement moving away from the traditional chemical inputs, more and more biological or bio-based inputs. So we have already a national program in place. We have also at state level some programs in place. Our state, where we actually lived in, was the first state in Brazil also starting the local program. So we have already quite well-developed system established to register and also certify those products. The government provides incentives directly to the use of those kind of inputs, as well as funding research to promote the industry. But there are, of course, challenges in place regarding the enforcement, especially in more remote areas. There is a hot discussion on should we have on-farm production of those kind of inputs or not. And it's not a simple issue of the interest of the big companies, but it's also an issue of how safe are those modifications we do on farm without an effective quality control on what's being multiplied. If we are multiplying, let's say, rhizobia, but together we have other bacteria that may be harmful to humans, so we may have problems in such kind of, let's say, without control modifications. So this is a challenge and a big topic in Brazil. Then from India, we saw from the documents we assessed, they have, of course, legislation there for the traditional inputs, so fertilizer and also insecticides and so on, or in general pesticides. There is a clear role, responsibility for the ministry, but then looking to the bio inputs, it's mostly related to. We have a long experience already with biofuels, but with bio inputs, it's not so far advanced yet. But they're working on it. They have been some barriers. Also regarding the difficulties in enforcement, there is still a lack of awareness. So not all farmers are really aware that those kind of inputs may be useful, or may create less impacts on green health impacts. And there is the prevalence so far of unregulated products. So many products are very informal. Okay, so far. Then Nigeria, as an emerging country in this scenario, they are trying to also establish those kind of frameworks for registration and certification. However, they have more limited resources, they have lack some technical expertise, and of course, there is also prevalence of unregulated products. This creates some additional trouble compared to other countries. Some initiatives, they established a national agency looking at biotechnology development, and also those agencies should support should promote the adoption of such bio inputs in the country. Comparing the three countries regarding different aspects, the regulatory framework is well established in Brazil. We have some problems in enforcement so far, but it's well established. In India, there's also a robust framework in place. In the case of Nigeria, it's still being developed. The implementation is effective already in Brazil. It's improving in India. It's still limited in Nigeria if we compare directly to the other countries. The challenges, the main challenges in Brazil, the enforcement in the most remote areas. In the case of India, still need to more efforts on the awareness, to raise the awareness of the farmers regarding the opportunities, the possibilities. In the case of Nigeria, the limitation resources and of course also in expertise may create difficulties for such a program. So the most common barriers and challenges we saw from those three countries. We have sometimes unclear regulations. We have some regulations that different regulations say different aspects on the same topic sometimes. This is, of course, complicated. This creates lack of comprehensive guidelines for registration. It makes it more difficult for a company to register a new bio input, for labeling, and also for quality control. There is, of course, not insufficient support, so government not always has enough money to promote the incentives to increase the adoption of bio inputs at farm level. And then the awareness limited. Not all farmers are, all the actors in the supply chain are really aware of all the potential, but also the risks of using such kind of inputs. So the education needs to be improved and to enable a better environment to promote such kind of products. Then some market issues. There are, of course, not always the one check, and not always the level of quality is being ensured for all products that get to the market. Then the main recommendations for improvement would be, of course, to strengthen the regulatory capacity in the countries. This means investing in technical and institutional capacity to effectively regulate and certify those bio inputs. We need a better harmonized regional standards, so different, we could promote regional marketing also from one country to neighboring countries could be improved if we have a more harmonized framework. This means we need to also to talk with our neighbors, but we not always need. And of course, increase the awareness. We need to create and implement campaigns, to create educational programs to farmers and as well as to the consumers. Consumers also know that a crop, a food crop that they consume that's has been grown using bio inputs may have less, because less problems than those that use all the pesticides available on the market. So those are the main aspects. Just checking again. The informal market challenges. We need to have a comprehensive market analysis to identify those challenges at the global level or at the country level, then develop the right strategies for specific informal market problems, of course, implement the right solutions that will fit to those specific conditions and monitor the implementation. To come to that, since my time is over, okay. Challenges complex, of course, it's not an easy job. How far the country has already succeeded is quite diversified. We need a collaborative effort to get to a more sustainable future if we really want it as our so thank you for your attention. Sorry for the 30 seconds that you talk.
Question. We have 5 minutes. My question may sound stupid. So I apologize for that. Because the session is reminded of crisis. So I'm wondering, when you look at your work and assessment through a crisis lens, how, and a stress test, how fit are the recommendations when multiple crises are being tackled?
Well, if you see the traditional way, let's say, traditional way of modern agriculture we have, I would say this is definitely a crisis. So this kind of agriculture has a lot of problems already in place. Even the big multinational companies are looking for remedies because they realize that there are solutions, the traditional solutions didn't work anymore, or didn't work so good as they were in the past. And they are looking for alternatives. And then we see several farmers trying to use different microorganisms since a long time already. You see it in the organic farm and so on. And how to bring all those strategies together in the interest of then the startups that are created locally everywhere. Then the interest of farmers. We have a recent discussion with it that for the legal framework, we have 2 different approaches. One is proposed at the private, proposed by the companies. So to sell a bio-input like a pesticide, for the same rules. For the farmers in one, farmers will have their right to produce their own bio-input. So the own farm production is having a really hot discussion sometimes.
Thanks. Then we'll have, please.
Yeah, maybe another, no, this question was not stupid, mine might be.
No, there are no.
No, but bio-inputs is a big term, no, for very varied products. So is there also some categories within those products which are treated differently? So I guess like simple ones which have been around all the time, so why not reproduce it? But others which might trigger processes, soil processes unknown? Are there some differences?
Well, each farmer may use what they always have used as long as they want. So this is for sure. The legal framework that's been put in place in the case of Brazil, that if you as a company, small company or as a multinational company want to register a new product that researchers at university or at the research organization identify that are useful, those kind of fungi or bacteria has specific effects on crop growth, on plant growth, then they, in a partnership with the company takes over and prepares the formulations of those kind of products to get to the market. Those kind of products have to follow, of course, the whole legal process, be registered, and then to have the right to sell them. But the farmers are able to produce whatever they always have produced. The discussion is new products. Can the research organizations just give it to the farmers directly? Who is going to keep it? Who's going to maintain? Like genetic resources in plants, or the same.
No, but you just need to, like, no? You could testify there's no hazard related to a certain product, or there is a hazard related. Is there something like that?
Well, at Edinburgh, we try to use, always look for microorganisms that provide some benefits to the soil, to the plant, to the animals. If a microorganism may cause harms and so on, we just leave them aside. We do not follow them if some risks are identified. So we just keep them out of the process and follow with those ones with we are sure that we have no known risks to the farmers or to the humans. Okay.
Your last question, coming back to this, you said it would be a best practice, right? That's what I understood.
From these 3 countries,
Yeah.
it seems to be more advanced already, because it's been in place for a long time. For instance, the biological nitrogen fixation, it's being used at almost each hectare of soybean that is grown in Brazil. They use inoculation with rhizobium.
I'm wondering, it's kind of formalization of the process, also you also just mentioned, it's making it more complicated. It's less opportunities also to small players that might not be able to reach the standards, right? And that's especially critical for less developed countries, I think, like you mentioned, India and Nigeria.
Yes.
What's your stake on this?
The more complicated the legislation process becomes, the more higher is the barrier for the small producers. This is always an issue. It's also in other sectors. If you create a process, it requires a lot of documentations, quality assurance process, certifications, and so on. So the small plant or producers of bioliquids, they're not able to follow all those requirements.
Yeah, and it might be also become
So an entrance barrier, clearly. And that's why one of those proposals of a legislation, of a new legislation, comes from the industry. They are interested, of course, in to keep it as their own business. Only big industry can register and sell specific kind of bioliquids. This creates a barrier, an entrance barrier to the small ones.
Thank you very much, Marcelo. Let's keep it here. Please remember you said something very important. It almost sounded like a message. You know, the higher the more sophisticated regulations, the bigger the barrier to entry. Or any version of this. Remember for the discussion, because I'll ask every one of us for the presenters for the key message to kick off the discussion afterwards. Thank you so much, Dr. You're welcome. There at 8. My pleasure to welcome Adam Saveri. Here you go. The lines are recorded. Yes. I find those attachments here. You will be talking, or actually you can bear climate smart shelter in Mozambique and Pakistan.
Thank you so much. As you just said, I'm Adam Savelli. I am a PhD candidate at SAL. I'm also the regional lead for South and Southeast Asia on the CGIAR climate security team based in the Alliance of Biodiversity International, and I'm personally based in Hanoi, Vietnam, where we have our regional headquarters. And the research question I'm going to explore today is how climate action interventions can contribute to humanitarian development, peace-building outcomes in displacement contexts. So the multiple crises we're looking at are climate-related environmental hazards, conflict, and displacement. And I'm going to do that in 2 case studies. The first is a climate resilient shelters initiative that UNHCR implemented in the Nampula province of Mozambique. And this is in response to Cyclone Gombe in 2022, which heavily damaged or destroyed almost all non-concrete structures in this area. And UNHCR essentially implemented a program of building concrete shelters for approximately 320 households across 2 displacement contexts. First is the IDP settlement in Korane, which mainly houses internally displaced people fleeing conflict in neighboring Cabo Delgado province, and also in the Mauritania refugee settlement, which houses more refugees than any other settlement in Mozambique. And as I said, the main intervention was the construction of these concrete shelters. On the right, we have some photos from Sindh, Pakistan, where IOM implemented a post-flood reconstruction initiative in response, also in 22, to historic flooding, which submerged a third of the country and hit Sindh province extremely hard. Here, IOM built a combination of approximately 489 concrete shelters for individual households, but also by using a community-based planning approach, constructed community infrastructure in 14 villages around Hyderabad that included access roads to the villages, wash facilities, latrines, things like this. And we did develop a fancy conceptual framework that I'm not going to have time to go into. We can address it in Q&A if you're interested. But some of the key sort of concepts here are how we define resilience. So we looked at the Sendai framework's definition, we built on it. So we define it as the ability of a household to anticipate, withstand, and recover from severe environmental hazards. We really wanted to bring in a bit of a political ecology lens, focus on power and empowerment and agency. And so we have this element of transformative adaptation that's really important here, which is defined as sort of the ability for households to make significant changes to their lives or livelihoods. And the methods we used are mixed. So we had a quantitative survey where we really tried to focus on perceived improvements to household resilience. So we asked households to what extent they felt their resilience had improved since they received these shelters, or since the interventions were implemented, I should say. We also did KIIs on the supply side with UN and government stakeholders who were key to designing and implementing the interventions, but then of course also with the intervention participants. So the families that actually received the households to get their words and their perceptions in there. We also did field observation. We spent between 2 and 4 weeks in each site, trying to understand what was going on the ground, talking to people, taking observations. And we did document review where possible, although the UN is not very forthcoming with many documents. And here, the data analysis is still ongoing, and there is just too many results to present in this time. So we cherry-picked some of the select ones. And you have humanitarian development and peace-building outcomes from top to bottom, and the interventions from left to right. And I'm going to start here in the top middle box with some of the common outcomes that we saw across the interventions. So in both places, the majority of respondents we spoke with reported significant improvements in their household resilience, particularly in their ability to withstand and recover from these environmental hazards, which makes sense when you're providing concrete shelters in areas where you have extreme storms and floods. We would expect to see this. We also noticed that larger households tended to have higher resiliency, which again makes sense. There's a lot of literature on how larger households have larger resource bases to work with and a larger menu of coping mechanisms to choose from in case of an emergency. But what's important here is that the improved shelter availability really facilitated direct improvements in environmental security, and that in turn facilitated improvements in economic security. So now I'm in the middle box here. So in other words, because households now had concrete shelters and they had to spend less time and financial resources investing in repairing them every time there was an extreme event, they had more savings in the bank to spend on whatever they wanted. They also had more time, which often translated into more time to spend on income generating activities, such as agricultural production, of course, but also it made them able to travel further from home to sell their goods. So there were markets that were further away where they were able to earn more money than they were able to travel to. And in many cases, they were also able to stay away from home longer to make sure they sold all of their goods before returning. Women also reported that they were able to go to the fields on days when it was not really an emergency storm, but when they would have otherwise not felt comfortable leaving their children at home to go work in the fields. So if we move to the left now, we focus a bit on UNHCR and Nampula. We saw similar gains in resilience for women and men when we controlled for gender. But when we moved into the sort of development space, a lot of the participants that we spoke with felt that the intervention didn't really adequately address the fundamental developmental issues that the community was facing, which were a lack of economic opportunities, poor electrification, poor water access. So for the households that received the shelters, which was not all households in the communities, they were doing well, because they now had a concrete house. But these benefits didn't accrue at the community level. The participants also wanted greater involvement in how the intervention was designed and implemented. For many, it felt very top-down. They didn't understand how many shelters were being constructed, or how and why some people were getting them but not others. This, in turn, moving down to the bottom box, led to increases in intra and inter-community tensions. And we saw this between the host and the displaced communities, who were already there were tensions there already. And even though the intervention targeted each 50-50, both felt that UNHCR was favoring the other community, even though that wasn't actually the case. We also saw tensions between those who received shelters and those who didn't, which makes sense. If everybody is in need, but only some people get support, you would expect this. Community members who didn't receive the shelters also pulled back from some of the local governing processes and from engaging with UNHCR because they felt like their needs weren't being addressed. And finally, the contracting companies that UNHCR used sourced labor from the communities, which is a good thing, but then failed to pay them for months sometimes, which is a bad thing, and led to tensions. Moving over to the right column and looking at sin. So whereas we saw similar gains across genders in Mozambique and Pakistan, women noted a much higher gain in resilience than men. We think this is because there was also the wash and the latrine infrastructure developed, which gave the women a place to tend to their hygiene in private, which they didn't have before. And I mentioned that they used this community-based planning approach, I think I did, in Sindh, where IOM formed committees within the communities and let these committees decide how much of the investment went toward community infrastructure and how much went toward individual household infrastructure. And these committees provided women with incremental leadership opportunities that they reported they wouldn't have had otherwise. And we also saw that these committees were given actual input on investment decisions, which improved the empowerment of the communities to make these decisions. And there was a renewed sense of place and sense of ownership over the communities once they were actually constructed in the end. And then finally, because whole villages were reconstructed and everyone in the affected area received shelters, there was no tension between participants and non-participants. And these committees that were developed primarily to facilitate the intervention had a positive impact also on intra-communal collaboration. And we saw this through enhanced conflict resolution mechanisms and resource sharing as well. And so moving on to the final slide, just looking across both the cases, making some generalized conclusions and recommendations for future climate action interventions in displacement contexts. During the design stage, it's really important to increase local ownership of these interventions by giving meaningful input to a diverse group of community members in the affected area. This can be done through committees, which, if pluralistic, are very useful for this, which means you can't just speak with the community leaders or the chiefs. You need to really have representative swath of the community here engaged. And the committees need to be given actual decision-making power over investments. They can't just be formed in name only and then left to wither. During implementation, transparency and multi-directional communication is very important. And now, a lot of the tensions could have been mitigated if UNHCR just had a forum for actually explaining the intervention in a better way to the community, and the community could feed their concerns back up. And then throughout the life cycle, having conflict-sensitive approaches is really important to maintaining social cohesion and mitigating tensions. So these are conflict analyses that happen several times, identification of key conflict drivers, and having conflict resolution mechanisms that everyone knows and can quickly adhere to. And then finally, these climate action interventions are very well funded, and they're really an opportunity to support land-based local livelihoods in these areas. In a lot of displacement contexts, people are dispossessed from the land. These are a good opportunity to advocate for policy reform, ecosystem restoration, value chain development for key goods, things like this. And that's all for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Adam. Good points. Floor is open. We have 5 minutes for asking questions.
How did you pick your study cases? Did you already know that the outcomes would be contrasting, or you thought they were both best practices? And did you already have a focus on history?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. We knew that we wanted places that had overlapping climate and conflict hazards. And then we also wanted displacement contexts. And so if you're looking at displacement and you're looking at UN agencies, and even dealing with IOM and UNHCR, we had the Alliance, the climate security team, we developed strategic partnerships with them both. So we went to the agencies and we said, here's the research question, here are the types of programs that we're looking for. And then with them, we sort of were able to identify the specific geographic context that were most suitable.
Thanks. And I forgot to ask, if you were to mention your name and organization, then it would be easier to find you afterwards in case you want to continue the conversation later on. You want to add yours?
Okay, I'm Sarah Graf from University of Poland. I'm Suzanne from EV. And it's easy to see this, yeah, maybe we should see some results here because I've been talking the last month with your colleagues online. So I was wondering, now as you are in conversations also with those agencies, IOM and UNHCR, what is their reaction out of this first preliminary results? What are their, how can they take this?
It's mixed. I think that a lot of people within the organization already, both of them really understand the humanitarian aspects very well, especially at UNHCR. This is primarily a humanitarian response agency. The development and the peace building and the climate action as well are all very new. These are huge organizations that have been operating for decades, and it's like trying to steer a cruise ship, to use a cliche. The developmental recommendations about increasing ownership, decreasing the UN agency's own power over these, and sort of devolving power down to the communities is pretty well known and decently accepted. They don't like hearing that the interventions can cause tension. Again, it's well known. I think it's not a bit of an open secret, but it's one that's quite challenging because often, you know, it's great when IOM has the resources to come in and rebuild whole communities, but sometimes you don't have those resources. It forces the agencies to make very difficult decisions. And so in that pool, they use a vulnerability-based metric and they try to identify the most vulnerable households and prioritize those, which is reasonable, but if you don't have the resources to go around, it's very hard to prevent some of these negative outcomes sometimes. So they can be a bit sensitive, I think, because they don't always have the tools to address the issues. It's challenging.
Thank you. No, you're, sorry, I didn't pick your name in the first round.
Yes, certainly. Yeah, thank you very much. So it's very different environments, no, where the study took place. So, well, my main takeaway would be it always makes sense to have community building as a basis for any kind of intervention. But on the other hand, you also mentioned we have this trade-off between serving everybody and having a quick response to avoid further damages. And also, in your study, so I worked in Nabuda, so as well, and it's, yeah, you have different kind of communities with different social cohesion, and from Pakistan I also heard that their this community building is super successful, and while in the Pacific environment, there's a little bit different kind of attitude, more family centered. So did you also find something like that?
Yeah, to a certain extent. And I think that, you know, the whole notion of the humanitarian development peace building nexus is, you know, largely an academic notion. And conceptually, you can make it make sense with frameworks. Of course, you can't address one aspect without talking about all three. In practice, it's extremely challenging. And at an operational level, when you have an organization that actually needs to implement an intervention here, it can be impossible. And so there are, in the discourse, a lot of people challenging this. But in the agencies, there still is a push to try to work across these. And I mean, the social settings are really important. In Nampula, as you said, we had a sort of clear division between the displaced communities and the local host communities. And there were pre-existing tensions UNHCR had to operate within and try to navigate. It's extremely challenging for any organization. Whereas in Pakistan, we were dealing with Hindu sharecroppers, primarily. So these are a minority within Pakistan. They're in a very poor part of Pakistan, and they are the poorest people there. They're landless. And so the communities were a bit more cohesive. You didn't have this host-displaced dynamic, which I think really advantaged the IOM intervention in a way. It made it a little bit easier for them to operate. They operated very well there, I think, but I understand your point. It's challenging.
Thanks. One last question.
Thanks for the talk. Did you thought about the rebuilding of shared spaces, such as medical centers, social facilities, and education? Yeah, please.
No, so it's a good question. And in Nampula, it was really just the households that were being rebuilt. But in Sindh, in Pakistan, they did have this idea, they would go to the communities and through a democratic process with these committees, they would say, how much do you want to spend on community infrastructure and how much do you want to spend on the households? And then within the community infrastructure, it was meant to be a menu of items, schools, hospitals, roads, wash, a lot of the things you just mentioned. But even IOM would say that sort of a lot of the focus ended up getting put on wash because that's what was it was easy for the communities to understand. IOM also has some expertise in developing these. So very often it was water infrastructure, but something that they're trying to integrate into future iterations of the intervention is a wider menu of community infrastructure for communities to choose from.
And probably the conflicts will lower due to that, right?
You would think so, yeah. I mean, like I said, we didn't have much conflict in Sindh to begin with, but we did see that there was additional collaboration after we left in terms of resource sharing, conflict resolution mechanisms. So I would phrase it more as increasing collaboration than mitigating conflict, but yes, essentially.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Adam.
Thank you.
Well, from the humanitarian sector to agroecology and agroecological contributions. Welcome to Nelson. So you will be talking about the paper on political economy. The political economy around the agroecology transitions. Over to you.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Sonali. I'm presenting our work, which was part of an agroecology initiative, which has been going on in 8 countries, and India is one of the countries. And in India, it's going on in 2 states, and one is Madhya Pradesh, which is the central state of India, and other is in the south Indian state. So this work is primarily based in the Madhya Pradesh, which is the central state of India. And this work is more or less with support of a civil society organization that we have collaborated with. It's called SES, and we try to build upon their work and try to support their work with our studies and our findings. So I will talk a little bit about why we are trying to focus on landscapes. So when we talk about agroecology and when we say that that we want to realize agroecology in its true essence, we need to move beyond farms. And why move beyond farms? Because there are different landscape, there are different mosaics that help in building this agroecological farm. And sometimes we want to these are different landscape mosaics that offer ecosystem services for agroecology. There is social metabolism where stock and flows of resources and environmental services that go beyond farms. And when we think about this agroecological landscape, there are different actors that come into play that needs to coordinate for this dream to come true. And then why we are trying to look at political economy lens is because we are trying to look at what are some of the barriers and opportunities in this coordinations and what can be some of the behavior drivers or some certain hooks that we can flesh out from this study and see and implement our results this kind of in other countries as well, or looking at policies in other countries. So the methods for this study is basically qualitative. We try to interview key informants, and how we arrived at key informants was we had these little workshops with the community and the collaborative organization, which is SES in our case, and try to map out which are the important stakeholders that are important for this agroecological transition in this area, and which are the actors which are restricting this transition. And once we had that map laid out in front of us, we sort of did in-depth informant interviews with these stakeholders on their motivations, on their perceptions of agroecology. Those who collaborate, we try to get at why do they collaborate and try to build this mental model of a sort that we can utilize for other places. So this is a research question that we have been looking at. What are the barriers for this actor coordination, and what are the some of the behavior change drivers that we can get at? So these are the yeah. These are some of the activities that are happening in these coordination, and some of them might look very unfamiliar. So I'll explain that. Manrega investments. So for example, Manrega investments. Manrega is one of the pan-India scheme which guarantees 100 days of work, and it is the village level local institutions that are mandated for its resource allocation. So, and these could be natural resource management activities that can be taken up by the local level institution. So, but to direct these local village level institution into natural resource management activities that are sustainable, that are enabling for agroecological transition, that's where FES like organizations play a role. Similarly, there are some then as you go up in the space region, you can see there are individual farm level activities that could be done on an individual farm. But as we go up the ladder, we see that we would require actor coordination. So this is the coordination model, what it looks like right now. So yes, through its two groups. I'm sorry if the text is too small to understand. It says informal institutes and formal institutions. So these two are grassroots level organizations. One is called Mahila Sabhas, which are women groups, and others called village groups. So these two coordinate, and FES has these multiple rounds of interactions with these groups for different natural resource activities. And these then coordinate with Panchayat, which is a village level institution, and forest department. So these two departments are at the very core of this coordination, because since Mandla, which happens to be our study site, is a fifth schedule in forested area, and it has, because it is a forested area, it gives much more power to these local institutions to have any legal activity in these areas. So FES coordinates with these two organizations, and then on the periphery there are other organizations like Agriculture Department, Rural Livelihood Department, Livestock, and other CSO groups that coordinate with FES for technical expertise, for resource allocation, for identity, for beneficiary identification. So, so these are like Adam, our work is still ongoing, and so I cherry picked the major findings that we wanted to present here. So these are the institutions that we have mapped out who are important, and we try to map out their knowledge, their ideas, their motivators, and agency. So I would like to focus on this majorly. So what are the motivators we have found out till now? So the major motivators for these informal groups are that they want their say in the natural resource management. And similarly, these formal groups are one of the custodians of economic development and social justice, and they want to demonstrate the selective power in the village level institution so that they can have a major say in the village development plans. Similarly, these government actors have major motivators as they want to achieve their own organizational goals. So they collaborate in interest of their organization and sometimes with their personal goals also. So some of the actors, for example, said that they have political aim for future, they want to contest an election. So they want to have a good rapport with the community, so they collaborate. And while others say that it helps them achieve their organization goals. For example, one of the forest department officers said that when they help in lantana eradication, which is an invasive species in the region, it not only gives job to the local communities, but it also keeps them away from destroying the forest. So it's serving them both the purposes. So these are some of the motivation that we could find. And particularly for the civil society organization and private actors, I mean, the chart is self-explanatory. I will go over it here in the interest of time. So that in spite of all these coordination happening, there are still knots of coordination where there are tensions between forest authorities and the communities because forest as a patron and custodian of protector of forest acts sometimes it does not allow communities to access some of the forest areas for, and these communities are heavily dependent on forest for different non-timber forest products. Similarly, there are certain conflicts among with Panchayat, which is a local level organization for resource allocation as well, where communities feel that there are biases and there is a resource allocation sometimes happens to a particular group that benefits their vote bank in a political framework. Similarly, there are different priorities that sometimes for FES and Panchayat officers because sometimes a village level institution might want a immediate outcome in terms of their project, but FES would want a long-term solution or a long-term process. There is also variable understanding of agroecology among the stakeholders. Okay, okay. So okay, I'll go quickly. So there's a variable understanding of agroecology among the stakeholders. The stakeholders think sustainable agriculture practices, natural farming, organic farming. These are various dimensions of sustainable agriculture that stakeholders have. And there are, of course, delaying resource allocations and insufficient beneficiary identifications, but there are certainly some opportunities, but there are mutual gains in this collaboration, and by bringing the actors together, we can foster to have common visions and probably benefit from each other. Thank you.
Thank you. Now my apologies that are rushing you. Floor open. Questions and contributions. Who wants to add institutions? Let me break the ice. Please, thanks.
One question I would have,
Can you introduce yourself?
my name is Lawrence Bachmann. I'm an agronomist working in Africa and Asia and various things. I've just done a study on resilience and we looked into agroecology principles. And for India, we found out that actually also the private sector would play a big role, but in the concept, it's not here at all. That's why I just want to ask, did you not include it? Or?
Yeah. So this, as I said, I had to cherry pick the findings. So that's another set of presentation I would like to make for the actors who are not supporting this coordination in this region at least. So this is a very molecular region-based study. But yes, we did interview some of the actors who were not coordinated, and there's in fact a very critical impact. So, for example, since this organization, FES, has been working in the region for past 12 years for agroecology, still the consumption of chemical fertilizer has been going up. So so to understand that, there has been there's still data connection happening, and this is one of the critical things that we have in mind.
Thank you. More questions? We have 2 more minutes. Let me ask mine. How to practically reconcile perspectives from these various actors and institutions they bring to the table? How to not only acknowledge but align or negotiate an alignment?
Yeah, so that's the, I mean, like my superior, like my colleague who I have done this study will have answered this better, but as she puts it, I'll quote her word that you should always give someone something that they want in order to get their money. So that's the reason that we have been trying to have this study. So what are the mutual benefits that we can offer to these stakeholders to come on with this? And once we have touched out through multiple stakeholder meetings and workshops, probably this we will inside. And while reconciling, it's very important to keep in mind the power dynamics, the power structures, and that's another word game that we did.
Thank you. Right, then, thank you so much. Next on the agenda is Susanne Bruder from IMI in Köln. We will be talking about circular innovations initiative in not comfortable with this one.
Shall I lose the microphone? Maybe better? Okay, let me try. Okay, my name is Susanne Boder. I'm working as researcher at the International Water Management Institute. And I'm presenting a work that we have done or that we are doing under the CGIAR initiative Resilient Cities. It's about circular bioeconomy for sustainable resource management and livelihood improvement in Ethiopia. Next slide. Circular bioeconomy is an integrated approach that combines the principle of circular economy with bioeconomy. It aims to optimize the use of biological materials while minimizing waste and environmental impact. Its aim is to close the cycle, as you can see here in the picture. And why we look at Ethiopia? Because Ethiopia is heavily reliant on agriculture, yet much of the organic waste generated from the sector, such as crop residues and animal manure, are not fully utilized. Population growth and rapid urbanization additionally also leads to a lot of waste generated in cities and a growing waste generation rate. The current waste practices are inefficient and resource recovery is minimal. By adopting circular bioeconomy, Ethiopia could transform this organic waste into valuable resources, such as bioenergy, organic fertilizer, biochar, or other valuable products, and benefits for the environment, but also create jobs and local livelihood. Next slide, please. So we are looking at three key challenges linked to this topic: soil degradation and erosion, pollution and biodiversity loss, and of course, economic vulnerability because of this dependence on agriculture, and also environmental degradation and resource depletion, especially soil health, underdetermine this long-term economic growth. So our main research question in the study was, how can circular bioeconomy address these challenges and look into how to improve livelihood by using these practices. Next slide, please. But let's go a bit into the insights and look where does the waste come from and what resources to use. So we see here some data collected by other authors, and we see the waste generation rate is at 0.45 kilograms per capita and day municipal solid waste, which is often not properly managed, and it is very visible in the bigger cities in Ethiopia. It's estimated that at the moment around 12,000 tons per day of waste are generated, but they are supposed to double due to urbanization and population growth by 2030. Between 60 and 78% of this municipal solid waste is organic. And in total, only 5% of the municipal solid waste is recycled. Similarly, in agriculture, and you see this on the right side of this slide, about 60 million tons of unused crop residues could be reused for bioenergy or other valuable products. So summarizing, the major challenges are low recycling rate, high organic waste content, and unsustainable waste management. In many cities and towns, waste management is inefficient or sometimes also non-existent. Collection rate in cities ranges between 40 and 60%. There is concluding a huge potential to recover those resources. Next slide. The study in Ethiopia was a part of a bigger study that we did about investment climate for circular bioeconomy in 15 countries. And Ethiopia was one of those countries. This overarching assessment looked at 5 indicator areas, criteria: the regulatory framework, the business climate, the governance climate, access to finance, and entrepreneurship ecosystem. We are now in the process of complementing this study with data collection and validation on the ground in Ethiopia. Next slide. So I will present a few first findings. So when we compare Ethiopia's regulatory framework around circular bioeconomy, we look into policies and regulation bylaws in the area of environmental protection, waste and wastewater management, renewable energy, and circular economy policies. We also identified key organizations supporting this framework. And you can see here that Ethiopia in this table has a diversity of policy. Even currently, it's drafting at the so-called National Circular Economy Roadmap with the aim to cut carbon emissions by 68% by 2030, boost recycling and reuse of products, of new materials, and create more green jobs. Next slide. But often, this you see in this slide about the maturity of those legislation, although many policies are in place and regulations are drafted and even adopted, there's a major challenge in implementation and enforcement. There's actually a need for stronger policy coordination, also cross-agency collaboration in this complex sector, and enforcement capacity on the ground to really enforce those regulations. Next slide. Yeah, but what are their entry points for valuable products, and how can we recover? What kind of business model could create livelihood and improve resource management? As I mentioned earlier, CBE, or circular bioeconomy, reduces reliance on virgin resources. By producing, for example, organic fertilizer, the country could also save import on chemical fertilizer. Farmers and SMEs can benefit from new income streams through bio-based products here. Promote also sustainable agriculture and combat soil depletion. At the same time, also creating new opportunities on bioenergy and renewable energy. Here are a number of potential business models for creating such bio livelihoods and improve resource management. We can generally categorize them in 3 areas: the energy recovery, the nutrition recovery, and wastewater recovery. All those create different business opportunities and also can create job opportunities and address the waste challenges. Next slide. We then look deeper into the entrepreneurship in Ethiopia, and we see that there has been starting initiatives from SMEs, micro enterprises, but also from the NGO sector to promote initiatives that recover resources. However, most of them are a very initial stage and small, and even they have been maybe put in place like this integrated biofarm enterprises 20 years ago, but they are not operating anymore. They cover mostly waste recovery streams through composting, producing organic fertilizer or bioenergy production. But there has been also some experimental research conducted in vermicomposting and black soldier fly farming for insect protein production. Our analysis of the investment climate concluded with three major challenges for those entrepreneurs. There's a lack of regulatory clarity, and also there's almost no business support. Limited access to finance for small business is a general issue in Ethiopia. And furthermore, there are infrastructure challenges. Next slide. I would like to conclude my presentation with a few observations. We can identify potential interventions in three main areas that we have to address if we want to promote circular bioeconomy in Ethiopia. Lack of awareness and education, also understanding of the benefits, infrastructure and logistic challenges, economic consideration, because resource recovery might be more expensive than traditional unsustainable waste disposal. But at the same time, also we have limited market demand for products, and we have to look into how we can incentivize this. Also, we can see that the policy environment is not an easy one. You have often inconsistent policies, or there is a lack of coordination. And finally, there are behavioral and cultural factors. If we look in the future, Ethiopia could enhance its economic growth, also agriculture-based economy, by enhancing and harnessing organic waste potentials. Bio-waste is not only an environmental, but also an economic opportunity. And it would be capable to create jobs. By fully adopting bio-waste management strategy, Ethiopia can build a more resilient and sustainable economy. Thank you.
Thank you. Floor is open for questions and your contributions.
You kind of just mentioned the political context as being a challenge on your last slide. But, you know, Ethiopia is like a very specific political context where implementing any kind of policy is quite difficult. So maybe could you elaborate on like how the Ethiopian context is really a challenge?
I have to say we are still at the early stage, and most of the results are more from this study that we did in 15 countries. That means we used also quite global indicators. For example, especially for the business environment, we used indicators like the World Bank's ease of doing business, right? So we found out that, of course, I mean, all those general business hurdles affect also entrepreneurs in a sector that is quite new, right? So we are now in the process to dive deeper and look on the ground, and also conduct consultation workshops and validate our finding that we found based on the secondary data.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, I was wondering when you say there's so much biomass available somewhere, like in the agriculture sector, so especially grains, you know, there's 70-something% of residue from that area. So what's done with that now? Is there any use for these residues nowadays when it's not used in the bioeconomy?
Actually, there are a few uses, because it's traditional uses. Like, for example, the crop is just burned on the field, right? And it has also some additional benefits for the crop. But if you would recover them, of course you could have a different and maybe more economic use than how it's happening at the moment, right? An issue, of course, with agriculture waste is also often the logistics. When it comes, if you want to use it at a scale. So often on-farm practices work much better, right? But therefore, farmers need to know those approaches and also implement them, right? And see the benefits. Sometimes it's also about changing practices.
Thank you. Do you have a follow-up question?
Yeah, because I see there's the trade-off sometimes. You know, you already have some maybe low efficiency uses in the smaller holder or the smaller scale, and the potentials are usually a little more centralized solutions.
It's not true. I mean, it really depends. Huh? The slide I showed where we see all these different business models, that's the work my colleagues have done a few years ago, looking at initiative around in the global south. And we found when it comes to economic, it's not always the scale. Of course, economies of scales make sometimes sense, but sometimes it doesn't make at all because of the logistics. If you have to move any kind of big waste amounts, economics makes no sense, just, you know.
My question would be, have you identified any pilot projects which try to, for example, treat waste of urban wet markets in order to see how it could be scaled up from small examples?
Yeah, I mean, the table I showed are first initiatives. You see, you have even more. ISIPE, for example, have done some good work on these insects. And there are a few actors already on the ground also trying to pilot. We have to see now our CGIAR research initiative is coming to an end. And in the next phase, we would like, of course, go into that. We are also operating in other countries, mainly in Ghana and in Kenya. And there we have set up pilot, for example, in Ghana, quite successful one with a private sector initiative that is using safely wastewater for growing fish, and similar also a co-composting facility. In Kenya, we are currently setting up also or piloting this insect waste-based insect farming.
Thank you. Let me ask one last question, please. In Ethiopia, there are, to my knowledge, a couple of agro-industry platforms. You know, so this open forum where different actors come together, private sector, community. Is circular bioeconomy any issue with that?
To my knowledge, not yet, but there is potential. There are smaller initiatives, for example, in the coffee industry also, but it's more selective, and it's often the bigger players also that have already the access to the knowledge and the practices to implement. We have actually some very good examples from Ghana, where EMI has been working since longer in this field, and where we set up a circular bioeconomy innovation hub, which we aim also to maybe expand in other or bring those experience to other countries.
Thank you very much. We have been moving to the fifth presentation, which will be held online. Joseph, can you hear us? Well, as long as we can hear him. Let me introduce Joseph Karugia. Here. Nairobi. We'll be talking about the gap between agri-food policy and science in Kenya. Joseph, if you can hear us, we will be texting you when you reach 8 minutes, and again when you have resources of 10 minutes.
Yeah, thank you. I do hear you. I think the sound was a bit not as good as one would have wanted, but I did follow some of the presentations. Yeah, good evening, good afternoon. My name is Joseph Karugia, and I'm with the International Livestock Research Institute. I'll be presenting our work on bridging the policy gap between, the gap between policy and science in Kenya. This is work that we have done with colleagues working on the CGIAR initiative on national policies and strategies. And they are from International Food Policy Research Institute, International Potato Center, and also one of the others is from the Ministry of Agriculture and Livestock Development in Kenya. So by way of introduction, we have seen increased calls for evidence policy making at country, regional, and global levels as economies become more complex and face unprecedented challenges and crises. However, despite these demand and of course the ability of researchers to respond given the availability of data and computing power, we see that research-based evidence is not always put to full use by policymakers. Next slide, please. The process of how evidence is integrated in policy is known as science policy interface. So we set out in this study to understand how the science policy interface in Kenyan food systems works, the challenges of integrating evidence into policymaking, and the directions that researchers and policymakers should take to improve the process. These kinds of questions have been addressed, but mostly in conceptual ways without a lot of efforts towards collecting real world data from actors. And we...
Also the microphone, please, so that we can hear you.
Sorry?
Please move closer to the mic if you can.
Okay. So, is that better?
Yes.
Okay. So we used qualitative research methods to describe the science policy interface in Kenya and assess the constraints and opportunities facing it. Next slide. So, I think you moved too fast. We collected data from 42 key informant interviews involving government representatives, donor institutions, researchers, and private sector associations. Initially, we selected purposively 32 key informants, and through them, we snowballed to another additional 10. We had different instruments for government officials, research organizations, and private sector actors because they have different roles in the policy, science policy interface. Next. We asked respondents to tell us how, what strategies and policies they were aware of and where they were involved, their level of involvement, and the extent to which research was used. For researchers and government respondents, we also asked them about the challenges of integrating research into policymaking. And we used the NVivo software program to analyze the qualitative data that we collected. Next. So first we described the science policy interface, and not surprisingly, there is no single science policy interface in the country because research and policy landscape is quite fragmented. There is considerable donor influence in research and also policy making, and also the changing policy environments are quite complex, or make it quite complex. We did find that research is integrated in most policies, but the degree to which that is achieved varies by the level of involvement, quality of research, and sustained engagement throughout the policy cycle. So we find that there's quite considerable use of research evidence at the stage of agenda setting and early on in the policy cycle. But later on, where probably research could contribute more in implementation and as well as especially evaluation, there is much less involvement of research.
So that microphone, please.
I'm not sure. Okay, yeah. So private sector actors are involved in SPI and they're diverse and they serve different clientele, including governments, farmers, donors, and others. Next slide, please. We did find that researchers have challenges deciding how to prioritize who to engage with. And they often overlook important actors such as parliament. And this is informed quite largely by the sources of funding, which is mostly from donors. Engagement with bodies that work across administrative units, because a lot of agriculture and food systems work in the country is decentralized or devolved. Those bodies that work across counties become difficult working with researchers. Next slide. The type of research that researchers provide, or if you like, services and products that they provide is both hard and soft knowledge. They could provide advice, comments, or actually participate in drafting sections of the policies or leading the drafting of the policies. Next. And this could be through open door kind of engagement where they participate in public consultations and advocacy, or provide hard knowledge through written publications, webinars, online engagement, conferences, workshops, and so on. But also they could be invited, if you like, closed-door engagement to provide expert opinion, rapid policy advice, but also hard evidence by providing policy drafts and doing, for example, ex-ante impact modeling and impact evaluation. Next. From the respondents, why is research used in policy? They say it can serve an important role of informing policy, but it can also be used to validate policy decisions after they have been made. And we found the same situation sometimes applies to the private sector, where they are included in the policy formulation, but primarily to legitimize the process after it's completed. Next. So the SPI health is not great in Kenya, but there are positive trends and in improving the integration of research into policy, but policymakers and researchers collectively remain critical of the current state of the SPI, although we see existing and draft policies emphasizing the importance of research and also seeking to enhance the integration of evidence into policy making. Policymakers still remain policymakers often do not give priority to research, but also researchers feel that their work is undervalued. Next, please.
Show the 2 minutes.
Yeah, okay. So, so both researchers and policymakers, despite this unhealthy situation, they are keen to improve science policy interface, and there are recommendations on how they could do this, which is I'll turn to next. If you go to the next slide, please. So next. So there are efforts, as I indicated, to leverage existing frameworks to coordinate the research landscape. The current National Agricultural Research strategy and policy is very clear on how this coordination should be achieved. There are efforts to make policy making coherent and coordinated. We recommend that research institutes reconsider incentives for researchers to incentivize them to engage with policy making. There's a lot of emphasis on publications and less on engagement with the policy making process. Next. Donors provide a lot of the funding, but there's need to reconfigure the relationships with researchers and policymakers. And in this sense, perhaps we need more government funding of research so that they can also set the research agenda. Streamlining policy and research processes will also improve SPI. We find ministries don't have the technical capacity for policy making, but also researchers don't have the capacity to engage with policymakers. So we need to build capacity, investing in data infrastructure, especially at the county level. These are the devolved units. We need to institute clear data sharing protocols between government researchers and private sector. And finally, prioritizing converting data into usable formats for policy analysts and research findings into understandable language for policymakers. Thank you very much. Stop here.
Thank you so much, Joseph, for your presentation. Floor is open for questions, contributions. Please.
I'm not sure if this was your research focus, but how common is it for researchers to engage with civil society? So actors like national NGOs, labor unions, social movements.
So the researchers themselves, the research institutions don't have sufficient funding to actually set the agenda. So they respond quite often to those who can fund research. In many cases, the donors, but also in some instances, the civil society organizations them do engage. They do also interact during advocacy events. So there is exchange of information between researchers and civil society organizations. But again, as I indicated, the incentives for researchers to do that is limited because they are not rewarded for engaging, for example, in policy advocacy or engaging with policymakers. That's an area that requires improvement.
Thank you. Other? Okay. Let me ask one question to Joseph along your lines. Again, maybe not your research focus, but I'm wondering to what extent interest and power mediates the utility of research and evidence from the perspective of policymakers. Is it perhaps just choose and take kind of pattern?
Sorry, let me see if I understood your question. You're asking power and interest mediate
the utilization of research.
Yeah. So the government is responsible for policy making, and particularly the Ministry of Agriculture and Livestock Development is important. Is the main player in leading policy development, and that's a constitutional mandate. But then in terms of using research evidence, they will in many cases start the process, engage to some extent, and in some cases the analysts at the ministry may start with some desk, literature review and so on, and engage some researchers at that stage, but they want to retain control of the process. And they will, in many cases, use research to validate, if you like, the policy intentions that they already would want to pursue. So as I indicated, although there's a requirement that there's public participation in policy making, researchers may get draft documents and be asked to comment within a very limited time period, and therefore limits the kind of the quality of input that they can provide. But at the end of the day, it will be projected that research evidence was used and there was public participation. So it's kind of a process that is not really, in many cases, intended to use research evidence, but rather to validate decisions that perhaps the lead ministry would like to take.
Thank you so much, Joseph. We've reached the end, actually, of the entire session. I don't know how I lost minutes on the way, but apparently it is. So my sincere apologies. I still want to invite everyone and start with Joseph, actually, to convey your message at the speaker. I would ask the speakers to convey your message to us in a sentence, if you can. So, Joseph, what is your take-home message in a sentence?
Sorry, can you say that again, please?
What is your take-home message in one sentence?
No, an excellent session. I think I learned a lot, and it was good to hear the different experiences in different countries about the use of bio inputs, climate action, and so on. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Joseph. I see you.
Well, I just took a note. I think if we, in regard to institutions, if we try to sophisticate too much, then we create a lot of problems to the small ones. Okay. So we need to have good institutions, straightforward, to promote a good business environment, but not sophisticate too much.
Thanks. Adam, how does that sound?
That's good. I think that my key message would be that intervention participants need to have actual decision-making power in the intervention design and implementation. This sounds utopian, but there are actually very practical, simple ways of doing it.
I guess understanding the motivations and the perceptions of the actors is important. I mean, it's very difficult to draw upon or build upon any transition that you are trying to do. It's very important to understand what's happening at the industry there.
Thank you. Susanna?
Nothing to add.
Like that. Thank you so much. This was our first session or presentation. Thank you so much for your technical support. Thank you so much. Thank you. Next on the agenda, to my knowledge, is social gathering. Somewhere in that building, I call it wooden building. What's the name? It's the most famous female researcher of academia.